Good morning. It looks like it's 10 o'clock. Thank you for coming to this session. My pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, at least to those who have not met her before. Dr. Agnes Ngoma Leslie is a master lecturer and director of outreach for African Studies at the University of Florida. Dr. Leslie earned her PhD in political science at the University of Florida. She has several areas of expertise. I've just mentioned two: Africa and China relations and women in politics. In fact, one of our books talks about women in politics, social movements, and democracy in Africa, in which he highlighted the role of women in Botswana. She's editor of many academic journals. She's published series of Teach Africa. She organizes Summer Institute to retrain our teachers to go back to the classroom. Dr. Leslie is a member of several organizations. She is the president of UNA USA, vice president of African and African American Historical Society. She's also a member of the Alajua County Task Force on Education, that is to work with the school district to meet with the requirement of teaching African and African American history in the classroom. She has traveled extensively in Africa, in China, in the Caribbean, in the United States. She is a great mother of two graduates from Ivy League schools. So she's done almost everything right. It's my great pleasure to present my friend, Dr. Leslie.
Thank you so much, my friend. Ready for being here this morning. Am I too loud or too? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for braving the cold to be here this morning. I really appreciate your being here. So this morning, what I want to do is, last time I did an introduction to China-Africa relations 2 weeks ago. And so today, what I wanted to do is to look at one of the major initiatives of China and how that has impacted African countries, and also to look at how African countries are resisting some of the issues that come up. But also I want to talk about the current situation in terms of China, Africa, and how that might wake up. But before I do that, I would like to ask you a question. So how do you get to be a global power? Ignore what I just wrote down here. How do you get to be a global power? What is the making of a global power? Trade, yes. How else? How else do you get to be a global power? Armaments, yes, of course. Yes. Military, yes. Oil in your country, that makes you a global power. I know, that's interesting because African countries, there are so many of them with oil, but they are not global powers. Aid, big aid, okay. Okay, so let's focus on some of what China is actually doing. Okay, oh, very good, thank you. So China, depending on where you look at it, is China a global power? It is? It is? People are nodding their heads and saying it is. Well, depending on when China and who China is meeting. Because when China is talking with African countries, it says it's among its brothers and sisters. It doesn't look at it. It says it's the biggest developing country. That's how it looks at itself. But in 2013, President Xi Jinping announced what is one of the biggest centerpieces for China. Combining the Silk Road economic belt and the 21st century maritime Silk Road. And this is supposed to be really Xi Jinping's biggest signature thing in terms of development. So this actually weaves together two visions and was quickly dubbed the Belt and Road Initiative. When you went to China and, by 2020, everybody was talking about the BRI and what it's going to do. So this is how it's supposed to look like in terms of, so this was supposed to join two projects together. The yellow one, the Silk Road, and the blue one, the Maritime Road. And this is supposed to be the biggest thing, Xi Jinping's signature thing in terms of trade, but in terms of military, in terms of economic development, and in terms of trade, taking things from across different parts of the world. And if you can see on this one, maybe more clearly, the yellow and the blue, in terms of what China was trying to do. And the main thing with that was that the BRI, in the end, by 2022, involved 146 countries. 52 of those were in Africa. This was supposed to create a vast railways, energy, pipelines, highways, and everything. The main thing that we take from here is really to connect China to different parts of the world and use those parts of the world for trading, for imports and exports. And this network would also, expand Chinese currency, but also this would also include going in the interland. This was just not ports and, but this also included China going in the interland of many different countries. So the cost here, the initial cost of this thing was about $1.3 trillion. And there were different components related to that, including the military, as you pointed out. And all this is targeted towards China 2049 in terms of China resuming and becoming a huge power by 2049. That's the idea behind it. But it's not said all the time. But these are some of the 5 major priorities: policy coordination, coordinating China's policy and other countries, and in this particular case, African countries. Infrastructure connectivity, related to connecting infrastructure in the continent along the coastline so that it makes it easier for China to be able to to trade with African countries, but as well to take as much from Africa as it's possible. So, like I said, unimpeded trade and financial integration and connecting people. China is very big on the people-to-people development. So this was seen as a way to actually connect people to people in terms of China's soft power. So this is both China's hard power as well as China's soft power. So what is interesting is this, that initially in 2013, when this was announced, Africa was not included. Now, 52 countries were later included. But it was very interesting, to see that Africa was not included in the initial BRI. And when we asked even scholars in terms of how come Africa was included, they saw that like, oh my God, this is a major problem. How did we leave Africa out? Because Africa is supposed to be our partner. We are supposed to do this together. Every 3 years, China meets with these African countries in terms of policy formulation related to how it's going to develop that. So how are we going to deal with African countries in terms of ports and everything? So quickly China staggered and, said, no, 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 no. Africa has already been a part of it. Africa has already been a part of it. This was a misprint or whatever it was called. But as you can see, apart from the agenda, China's strategy with the BRI was expanding the military, political influence. And China looks to African countries for political influence because this is a part of 52 countries who actually, when they support China, really makes China's world influence actually bigger. So China saw that as a real big problem to be able to do that. So when we see BRI, and Chinese connection with Africa, 2013, Africa is not mentioned. 2015, at the FOCAC meeting, which is China's cooperative meeting, which met in South Africa, one of the biggest ones, where it actually formulated policy. The BRI, Africa is not mentioned there in terms of infrastructure. And then we come to 2018, BRI is at the center, and infrastructure in Africa, development of infrastructure is everywhere. Every single word that is talked about at that meeting was infrastructure. In 2021, you see that it's missing. Why? Because infrastructure has taken on, so much debt in terms of African countries. Therefore, China decided to actually change its wording and actually withdraw that. And then the last meeting, 2024, we see modernization becoming the key word from infrastructure, the changing. And modernization, we see modernization of Africa and other parts of the world becomes keynote. And modernization, we see it mentioned 30 times in Xi Jinping's speech. And it's mentioned 40 times in Beijing Action Plan for Africa, 2025, 2027. So I want to actually show you how that has actually played out in terms of, really infrastructure, ports, and everything. So if you look at this map, you see the different areas, the different ports, which actually Chinese companies have been involved in. Sometimes, really being active in refinancing them and development in terms of ports. You can see 78 ports across 32 African countries. And many of them are, concentrated in West Africa as compared to East Africa, 15 in Southern Africa, and 11 in North Africa. So what I want to emphasize in terms of the BRI, it was not just ports and infrastructure. It also related to things which had been done before, but it also related to networks within the continent. It also related to building infrastructure, building ports, but also, railways and everything else related to that. So all this was done at a cost, as you can imagine. For instance, if we talk about railway being built from Ethiopia all the way to Djibouti, you see the railway station, being built like that. So these were grand schemes in terms of China-Africa relations. Grand schemes which sometimes were just more expensive than what was foreseen. So the idea was that they would actually promote trade and, all kinds of things, community development along the way. But many times what was put on was much higher than what the result was. So the BRI, in the end, the reason we don't hear so much of it being mentioned was seen as a debt trap. China would provide huge loans, billions of money to African countries, to developing countries, when these countries could actually not pay back. So we see this especially in the example of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, which actually is, China, when Sri Lanka couldn't pay back $8 billion in aid, Chinese operators stepped in for a 99-year lease of the Sri Lankan port in 2017. So there was a fear around African countries that if this has happened, all these debts that we are coming up with, this could happen to African countries as well. But before we move there is some advantage. We should point out that there's some advantage to actually having the BRI and the infrastructure. The positives was that the BRI is still stimulating development in previously non-developed places. In African places, the railroad lines, ports, they're better built. People are able to travel faster, like in, I'm going to show a picture, in terms of Kenya, where they're able to do that. But it was also destructive in terms of the environment, because sometimes it was built without taking care of the environment. But the main thing was really, who's going to pay for them? Who's going to pay for them? So there was an opposition from these different countries. Some countries would take on this debt, to find the infrastructure. But also what was interesting is really that the fact that China would say and include infrastructure, which was started way before, and say this is part of the BRI. In terms of the Tazara, for instance, in Zambia, between Zambia and Tanzania, they would say this is part of the BRI, although this was actually started way before 2013. So many countries, signed up to the BRI, including, for instance, Italy, and signed off. So the main thing was that these were not aid projects. The investments had hidden costs. They still have hidden costs and required the use of Chinese firms. That was a major thing too. They needed to use Chinese firms. It's not like the Chinese would say, we're giving you money and you'll be able to do that. No, you had to use Chinese people. And even after the construction had been done, Chinese people would continue to run a certain percentage of that for some time, and they're still doing it. So as a result, some constructors, really canceled that, and, leading to projects and political backlash. So in terms of seeing the major gain here, China was looking at it in terms of, this is our project, this is what we need to do, but not so much as how it impacts African countries. And that was a big problem. So some countries could not pay back. Many countries are still dealing with that. Sri Lanka, the issue of Sri Lanka came out, there's a big backlash, so that China had to step back and said, okay, no, we're not doing this, for some time. We're going to reevaluate this. So I want to show you how countries navigate not being able to pay back. Because also what I want to do in the second part here is to show you that, yes, African countries have taken all these loans and everything, but what I want to actually raise is the voice of African countries, that they do have agency, that they don't just sit back, but they also actually try to play their role in that case. So how does China deal with debt defaulting countries? So Zambia was the first case to default in terms of payments of its loans, and much of that paid, which was due to be paid to China. This was the first case in terms of non-payment. Zambia just said, we don't have the money, we cannot pay, we will not pay it, at least for now. And China took its time really, in terms of China, if I can give a little background of China-Zambia relationship. So Zambia and China have had a very strong relationship going back to the 60s, to the first president, Kenneth Kaunda, and building the Tazara. And they call each other all-weather friends. So how do you treat all-weather friends when they cannot pay? Was the question. China just defaulted. China just stepped back. China was quiet. And Zambia really suffered during those times. So I want to point out the fact that this president here, Hakainde Hichilema, the current president of Zambia, was slow actually to turn on to China because he didn't want to choose between China and other Western countries like the United States. So he was actually very slow to sign on. He was watching that. But when this happened, Hakainde was looking around and looked to the United States. But the United States also looked to Zambia because at that point, I have never seen Zambia, being in the limelight as much as it was in 2022. All the United States officials were landing on Zambia. We are friends. Zambia is ours, And then it took even, Jessica Ellen, honestly, to come to Zambia. Yellen visited Zambia and called on China to address Zambia's debt issue quickly. And I quote here, it's taken far too long already to resolve this matter, calling upon China. It was interesting because day after day, you would see a stream of US officials because then they saw this way of actually aligning themselves with Zambia. But China also hit back. He said, no, you know what? Don't call on us. Cope with your own debt first, China tells US over Zambia debt relief. Like, don't actually get in here and just start telling us what to do. Cope with your own debt first. The Chinese government says the United States should stop pressuring Beijing on debt relief for Zambia and focus on averting a government default at home. So China was hitting back, which could have repercussions for the global thing. And then they said the biggest contribution that the US can make to the debt issues outside is to cope with its own debt problem and stop sabotaging other sovereign countries. This was the Chinese embassy in Zambia making a statement. So you can see how our countries actually play each other, how the debt issue, instead of just being Zambia's issue, is being taken at the global stage, but it's being used by the United States in terms of empowering themselves. So the question we may ask, was the United States using Zambia and other African countries for its own strategic reason? And was China playing back to step on that role in terms of what it actually stands for? And was Zambia using the United States for its benefit? We see here, China was watching, and China is watching very carefully to say, don't call us. We are brothers in this thing. But then, might China alter its policy to accommodate the prevailing situation, a term called flexigemony? Like you deal with things according to the way that you see them? Could it alter itself? China did eventually. But there were a lot of officials, including the Vice President Kamala Harris, going to Zambia, which was, when you talk about Zambia, it's not really one of those countries which people talk about a lot of times. You talk about Nigeria, you talk about South Africa. But, Kamala's, Harris's trip was also to underscore where the United States stood, that it wasn't just going to be there, although in terms of aid, it wasn't giving as much as China was giving. But in this case, it saw an opportunity to actually talk about what the United States could do. So I want to talk about, without that, I want to talk about how African countries, most of the times we don't see, of course, we see the flashy, development going on, but we don't see how are the Africans navigating the scene. How are they dealing with the issue themselves? And I want to give you some examples of countries and how they've actually, pushed back. So in Liberia, for instance, you know, all developments, all kinds of packages related to that are outsourced to international independent people so that they can actually see better ways which actually benefit African countries. Because much of the development, when they actually just talk about it in terms of political leaders are easily swayed. In terms of the climate, they're easily swayed. They can sign on projects which they don't necessarily need. So, for Liberia, for instance, external partners are required to respect the rule of international aid and what is in it for African countries. What are African countries going to gain? And how are we going to develop this? And how are you going to implement it? Because many times, you see the aid being given, but actually not actually being supplied. Because with China-Africa relations, many times you find that the aid or the money that is given does not actually come straight. Sometimes it includes things which were done previously. So, countries like Senegal, Togo, and Tunisia, that's what they are doing. They are hiring international experts to be able to do that for them. So I want to actually single out, Tanzania in terms of this BRR. So, the China Merchants Holding International, said it would provide $11 billion to Tanzania to build a port, Listen to this. So this port would include imported material from China. It would include 99-year lease, meaning that they would not pay any taxes and they would lease it for almost 100 years. And there would be zero duty. And that, this area would only be allowed for Chinese manufacturers only to develop other, and China would have a commitment not to develop other ports. See this? China would have a commitment not to develop other ports and tax breaks for other investors for 99 years. I mean, think about that. For 99 years, Tanzania would actually leave everything to the Chinese, China merchants holding for almost 100 years. So these are the kind of deals that actually are supposed to be signed. And Tanzania angrily publicized the details, to build pressure, from the, its own people. And the president of Tanzania then said, only a madman can accept such terms. No, because this is why they pushed back and said only a madman can accept such terms. But you can imagine if you are in a desperate situation and many of the contracts that China signs are actually, secret. You can't have the terms of that. And so the president pushed back and the public of Tanzania, rose against that. They were really upset. The public was on board and the government decided, okay, this is what we're going to sign on. A 33-year lease, a lease. No tax holiday, none. No duty-free imports. Full regulatory oversight and no restriction of Tanzania's right to develop other ports. It's their country. Why would they actually have that? So they actually pushed back. The Chinese firm, read the mood and accepted all the terms, partly to save face and partly to diffuse a brewing, diplomatic crisis with China. This is one incident where people, they can't push back. But other countries also are pushing back in different ways. I want to look at Djibouti too. Djibouti is really a small country, but surrounded by water. And Djibouti uses its strategic location at the crossroads of Africa and the Middle East to offer China an opportunity to gain influence, over shipping lanes. But it's actually controlling that because Djibouti is actually a very interesting strategic point. There's Djibouti there rounded up. And so many other countries are in Djibouti, including the United States, including Japan. So Djibouti is located on the Horn of Africa, like I've shown you. It's the third smallest state, in Africa. It covers an area of 23,000 square kilometers. It's small, but it's strategic. It's at the crossroads of Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean. It's very strategic. It's a member of the African Union, the Arab League, and La Francophonie. That makes it almost within the Arab world. So it sees and plays its role right there. It actually plays its role related to that, requires, things which would benefit Djibouti itself. The United States actually has a base there. And so Djibouti uses its unique position to leverage, the funding that it actually requires. So countries, actually African countries, uses agency and their own positions actually, do what they need to do. So Djibouti has become a very important strategic location for great rivalry and the future status quo. You may not hear about it, but maybe at some point you do, and hopefully it's not to seize it or something like that, or to take control of it. But they are already, there's a US base there with 4,000 troops, and France and Japan is already located there. And China is busy with the infrastructure. But Djibouti has a say in how this is developed. So locating agency and non-state actors is not only at the government level that we see, agency. We see it even the grassroots levels. We see non-state actors, playing their role. In Kenya, for instance, people try to say, we need transparency in terms of trade. We need transparency in terms of what is being built because we may be actually, losing in terms of what we're getting. But we see in China-Africa relations, the workers especially, in the mining areas like in Zambia, playing a huge role in terms of fighting for their own rights. So we see resistance even at the grassroots level. In 2006, for instance, the biggest resistance that we saw in Zambia was when Zambia had seen these Chinese mining companies, doing a lot of things which were against the human rights. People were being misused, ill-treated, and a lot of people died. At one point, 50 people died in a mining accident due to the fact that, they were not actually paying attention to the environmental conditions there. So people on the copper belt of Zambia protested. And one time when the Chinese president Hu Jintao at that time visited Zambia and he wanted to actually visit the copper belt, they put up barricades and said, no, we're not going to have this person. The workers themselves said, we are not going to have to receive the president here because of all these things that are happening. So China actually is always learning. China decided we are going to have the first economic zone actually built in Zambia, in Africa, built in Zambia. So after the numerous accidents, people barricaded against that, and China decided, no, we are actually going to pay attention to this now, and we are going to do this. And because of that, even the wages that were paid to people actually increased. But also China, Africa saw one of the presidential candidates very upset with the situation, Michael Sata. He said, when I become president, if I'm elected president, I'm going to have relationship with Taiwan. Oh my God, that upset China. As you can imagine, China was livid and went to the president immediately and said, you know what? If this happens, we're going to withdraw all the aid, all the funding that we've given to this country. But actually, this was seen as interfering in the relations, in the Zambian relation with China says we will have non-interference of what goes on in the country. But when it said that, that was seen as actually interference. So when they actually saw that, they decided, no, we are actually going to support this actual candidate. Actually, the person lost at that time, but after some time, he did win. And after he won, he backtracked it because China has its way also relating to that. So what I want to point out is that African agency is evident in African countries. It's growing. It's not always as strong as we would like it to be, but it is. It's apparent in the innovative tactics that they use. For instance, in Ethiopia, people make sure that only 10% of the people who are actually from China are actually taking part in the projects. And many African countries have stipulated those kind of things. And working within the African Union, African countries have decided this is what we are going to do. But I want to say China is learning. China is learning. And China, the way China learns is actually every 3 years, like I said before, it has this huge meeting with African countries, all of them. In 2024, it had the meeting, the FOCAC meeting in Beijing. And you will not believe it, but China pledged $50 billion, to African countries. But this $50 billion is not really what we think it is. Some of it is money which has been spent before. $10 billion is an investment, 10.5, China has a way of actually writing all these things so that it looks really like it's a lot of money. But when you look at it, some of it has already been spent. And in the end, some of it is only very little left. But China is pushed back. After the 2020 pandemic, China's growth slowed down. As a result, China has pushed back and is not giving as much funding to African countries as it did before. So in the same vein, though, it's elevated Africa's relationship to all-weather China-Africa commitment with a shared future for the new era. I don't know what that actually means because I thought they always had an all-weather relationship with African countries. But, every time, the Chinese president comes up with a very lofty way of talking about China. We are in this together. We are brothers together. This is a win-win situation. So let's see where it goes. So now, in this 2024, the climate changed, the tone changed. So China is now focusing on modernization. I thought that was always the case. When they built all these railways and everything, I thought it was always modernization. But Xi Jinping's speech, keynote address, actually talked about this 30 times and 40 times in the Beijing action plan, because every 3 years, you remember this is 2025 to 2027. It is a call for the right to industrialize according to one's own cultural, historic, and social background without being forced to follow Western social, economic, cultural, and political model and norms. I mean, we wouldn't take, and I would like to hear your reaction to that. We wouldn't, argue about that. But as much as the summit emphasized the need for industrialization, including modernization of agriculture in Africa, which is needed in African countries, it also mentioned modernization as an approach to political and social governance. So China, in this vein, puts itself against with African countries and say we have the right to modernize and we have the right to see the world and view the world as we want, which actually is not really a problem, right? You know, China is now promoting a variety of governance models, you know, with the approaches to development according to African countries. You know, by identifying itself as a country of the global south, China is cleverly portraying itself as a victim of the rules-based order that is perceived to serve interests of few countries. Because Western countries say, we will make sure that before we give aid or funding, we want to make sure that there's human rights observance and things like that. But China doesn't look at human rights the same way as others do. It believes that human rights should be defined according to the society in which people are. So in this case, China is positioning itself as Africa's development partner and international ally. However, the flaws of the current order will not be enough for the continent, as you can imagine. China developed by cutting itself off and actually being able to do everything that it could. It's not the case with African countries. And of course, also, we must not forget that we're talking about 54 different countries here, you know, so that their borders are porous in most cases, so that that kind of development may not be feasible for African countries. So when we talk about developing according to their own means, a huge burden like this, what it leaves on African countries, I wonder whether we can actually talk about African countries, you know, westernizing according to their means if they are left with such huge debts. I wonder what the possibilities are, and I would like to hear from you. So this is another bullet train, you know, that was actually it's being built between Tanzania and Rwanda. Very fancy and needed in African countries. You know, the cost will be split between the two nations, with Tanzania forking out 1.3 billion and Rwanda $1.2 billion. It's needed, you know, and the actual builders actually are Chinese, of course, companies. So Africa stands on China's viewpoints. Most African countries want practical solutions to their problems. They want to avoid debts, though. And how they're going to avoid this when they already have them, you know. They want to also to avoid, you know, picking sides between the West and China, because they gain, 5 minutes? Oh my goodness. They have to be careful. I'm almost done. So, you know, if China wants to change the rules, the international rules, how will this benefit African countries? Is the major thing. Is this for their benefit or for China's benefit? So your thoughts? It's actually close to time. So what do you see as the approach, the best approach here? What do you see as a different approach to development? Do you think a Chinese type of development beyond China is possible for African countries? What do you think would be the best plan of action for African countries? And those are live questions for you. Yes.
I'm not going to answer those questions, but I am going to try to fill you also in. That is in the history of China. There's a book out when China discovered America, and it was before 1492. They have always placed markets where they have the people depend on them, yet not conquer them. So it's not a new strategy, and it seems to have worked until maybe now. But
Seems to
they,
work
they
for
are
China.
totally in debt to China, and how do they get out of it is the point.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. The hand up over there.
All right. Now moving to our Q&A session.
Thank you for your talk. Those of us involved in academia in the 1970s and 80s were happy to welcome scores of Chinese students who were funded by their government, postdoctoral fellows, et cetera, and they obviously went back to their country and did well. The issue is that a viable strategy for China to do the same? And the barrier is the Chinese language. The person I worked with the World Bank said that he has a PhD in economics, and that was the same amount of work as it was to learn Chinese.
Mhm.
And so I think, isn't that, you're not going to get the same kind of relationship between the Chinese learning English
Right.
and then them expecting African languages to
Right.
learn Chinese. Could you comment on that?
Yes, you know what? Actually, China is very good at learning languages. And also, you know what, in terms of, I know Swahili is one of the languages that they teach at the Chinese Foreign Languages Institute in Beijing. And they use that model to learn more about what is going on, So you're right, in terms of people going back, they go back to actually educate the policymakers in terms of what needs to be done across the world. So yeah, in terms of African countries, you see, China is going all over, Africa and learning as many languages as they can, because that is actually what guides them in terms of policy formulation. Africans are learning Chinese as well. Yeah. Also, we have, the Chinese institutes across African countries, which are situated at universities, where they're actually learning. And you have a lot of Africans also going to China. It's cheaper for them to go to China now and learn, different trades, especially technical trades, and come back to African countries. And they've been doing that for some time. Yeah.
Thank you very much for mentioning Sri Lanka. I've really enjoyed this program. I was aware of Sri Lanka relationship with China early on. Then I also learned that they could not pay back the debt. You said that China seized the port. What does that mean?
It took over the running of the port. It took over the running of the port for 99 years, meaning that Sri Lanka could not gain, financial gain from that because they were actually running it and managing it. China, the way it puts it, is really not that we are seizing it. We are just managing it until it becomes profitable enough for us to give it back to the owner.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
That's right. That's the way they put it. Yes.
The other thing is, I was long associated with an international engineering company, and I'm aware of the role of bribery in international contracting.
Bribery?
Yes, bribery. Uh-huh. And I'm wondering, do you have a sense or an assessment of the role of bribery in some of these arrangements?
That's a very interesting way. We may characterize it as bribery, the Chinese may not. For instance, if you went to China on a trip and, came back, I was talking to my students about that. You came back home, they gave you briefcases. They said, this is all the information that you have there. But, you get home, you find there's, maybe $30,000 in it, and you wonder, what do I do with this? This is actually true stories. You wonder, what do I do with this? Is this a bribe? Or is this a gift? If you find it, what do you do? Morally, what would you do? Many of you, would you call? I'm sorry. Give it to the university. And well, the thing is this. So people who called other people to say, you know what, I have this thing that happened. And the other person said, me too. And then me too. So 30 people went on a trip to China and found the gifts, I mean, is it a gift? If I go to the University of Florida where I work and they give me a T-shirt, for the talk that I've given, is this a bribe or is this a gift? They don't believe in copyright, right? So is this a gift? If you give me a T-shirt for this talk or you give me lunch for this talk, is this a bribe? But if you raise it to the $1,000, is this a bribe? I mean, this is the way they look at it, so the way we define bribe and with the way we define things in the Chinese culture, even when we come to human rights, we have to be careful because it's not what we think it is. Yes.
I'm just wondering, I saw that a lot of the money that China was spending in these African countries, there was no mention of educational programs associated with it, because are they raising a citizenry that will support eventually these ideas that China is doing and possibly not contributing to the welfare of the country? It is eliminating a segment of the population by not including anything educational in their programs and grants.
So China is learning. It also have, it has institutes as well, for learning. So yes, the ordinary model was like that, but China does have some learning, packages related to that. And also China has people-to-people training. It has training for people at different levels. It has, it actually brings China, people to China to actually train them in the Chinese way. I mean, that's the only way they can do it, right? Yes, Yes.
Yeah, I want to thank you for a really informative presentation. It's interesting that the African writ large realize that the Chinese practices make the British colonial practices look gentle in a lot of respects and benign. Let me suggest, you asked a question, let me try to answer it.
Yes.
There are models that African countries could follow to develop themselves in a manner which is respectful and successful. I can point out a few off the top of my head very easily. South Korea.
Yes.
Singapore.
Yes.
There are even African countries which have their own models, like Mauritius and Kenya, that have opened themselves up to free enterprise, low taxes, and they've been great successes. So I'm really thrilled that the African countries are recognizing China's model, which is really the debt trap. That's their model that they'd like to follow.
Right.
And it's great that they see options. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. What I'd like to say is that, when you compare the Chinese model to, say, the British, and say that the British were gentle in comparison, it depends on what we're looking at, right? So, many African countries were colonized by the British. Where are they now, 50 years later, So other countries which were not really fully colonized, I'd like to give the example, for instance, of Botswana. Botswana, really, the British didn't like Botswana. The only beef they had about Botswana is that the Botswana chief married one of their own, and they didn't like it. But Botswana now is the most democratic, one of the most democratic countries in Africa. It's almost one of the richest countries in Africa. And let me say this, when Botswana discovered diamonds in 1968, when they got independent, that made them the richest country. But if the British had seen and known of those diamonds before they left Botswana, Botswana may still be in their hands now. Botswana? No, it was not. No, it was not. No.
Great, thanks so much for a second great presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk particularly about how China is learning and negotiating with African countries. I was living in Mali in the 90s and saw that Chinese firms were underbidding other firms based on subsidies from the duty-free imports that were associated with the the embassy of China, and the result was that, and particularly in a road project in the capital Bamako, that road was taken on by a Chinese firm, and they did such a terrible job that within 6 months that road was gone, completely gone in the rainy season, and so it was clear that there was no regard by the Chinese government and Chinese state-owned companies for the Malians in that case, and the Africans in general. And, they did not abide by international standards. They didn't abide by environmental regulations. And what we're seeing today, it seems like the Chinese are really learning about how to be relatively responsible international donors. But, they are still stuck in how do you deal with countries that are taking on debt more than they can really handle. So there's a power imbalance between African countries and China. And how do you see that playing out in the future?
Well, thank you so much for that comment and the question. Like you say, China is learning, but also we have to appreciate, the different levels in terms of China. China is really not monolithic. It's not one, we tend to think about China, we say China, China. There's the China, the state, there are these other private governments, and there are smaller governments. It's smaller private companies which go to China. So these also take part in terms of the building. So the control that China has to do is control some of these levels, because it's not always the state, and the private companies that we are looking at, they are all different levels. Like I mentioned in terms of Tanzania trying to take over the port, then there's a pushback. But there are all these people who will be saying, because it's cheaper for them, it's a cheap contract, we'll do it. But also the tendency is we'll do it quickly. But you do it quickly and then, you don't do it well, and that's what China is also learning from. You don't have to do these things quickly, but they're still doing things like that. You find even like airports, there's something that is actually not done right here, but also you have to remember this also happens in China. It happens in China as well. It's not just that they're doing this in African countries. In China, you find some things which are not well done as well, So it's a question of learning both ways in terms of what it does on the African continent and other development countries, as well as China itself and within China itself.
Okay. There are some folks online. So next 2 minutes, let's see what that is. Whether there are questions from those online. Any questions, comments, or remarks?
No open questions. No open questions.
It won't open.
Okay.
Well, while we are looking for it, the lady asked question about education. In my travels, many places on African university campuses, they have Institute for Confucius.
Confucius Institute.
It's almost everywhere.
Yes, yes.
They're very aggressive.
Yes. But the Confucius Institute even in the United States. Yeah. They're everywhere, really.
It won't work. No one online. Okay. Well, there are no questions or comments from those online. Well, yeah.
Oh, okay.
If they are none, by my clock, it's already after 10 o'clock. I want to thank you all
So
for
there's
coming.
somebody raised his hand.
There's somebody?
Yes.
You want to be the last one?
They will be the last one.
Okay, we're going to make it very short and sweet.
It might not be a short and sweet answer, but what's on my mind, what happens if you overlay religion onto Africa, and particularly Islam, and as a way of life, and finance is part of the Islamic culture, and debt as being taboo?
You asking whether religion can play a role in terms of that? Well, there are examples where you have, strong religions and they're doing well. And you have examples where religion is really not helping in terms of the case, in terms of gender relations and things like that. But in terms of, countries being, Islamic, you have quite a few examples that you can come up with. So I think what that means, it brings us to the case that, Africa is also, very different cultures, different people, so that even when China tries to actually bring everybody on board to a certain type of even modernization or development, it may not work because we're dealing with different cultures, different people, and people have to actually find in it for themselves. So how many developments would we have there? So I hope.
And with that, we want to thank Dr. Leslie.
Thank you.
We hope you continue to be interested in looking at Africa as a part of the global community.
Yes.
Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I really appreciate your coming out and, especially as cold as it is, but to think about these issues, because these are current issues, these are topical issues. But, the main thing is really to think that, Africa is not also monolithic, but also the fact that, Africans are also pushing back. We don't get to hear their voices of people taking stands on different things. They may not be as strong as we would like them to be, but they are there. So I wanted to make sure that is clear. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.